At the same time, we devoted considerable time in each of those conversations to establishing clear boundaries or guardrails for the relationship. We talked openly about the fields where cooperation feels possible, the points where our perspectives differ, and the fundamental differences in our political systems. We made a point of acknowledging and respecting those differences. That kind of straightforward, steady, and honest exchange is exactly what builds a more reliable and productive connection. When I compare it to our relationship with the United States, there's no question. The bond we share with our southern neighbor is far more layered, far deeper, and much more extensive than what we have with China. That's simply a fact. Having said that, yes, in terms of how our interactions with China have unfolded over the past several months, the relationship has become noticeably more predictable, and the proof is in the results we're already seeing. The statement you're referring to comes from a real press conference exchange during Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's historic visit to Beijing in mid-January 2026. This was the first trip by a Canadian Prime Minister to China in 8 years, following years of strained relations that included diplomatic freezes, trade disputes over canola and other goods, and broader tensions. During a Q&A session with journalists after his meetings, including an extended session with President Xi Jinping, a reporter from the New York Times, Martina Stevens-Gridneff, asked the Prime Minister a pointed question. She essentially wanted to know if, based on his recent experiences, he now sees China as a more predictable and possibly more reliable partner for Canada than the United States is right now. Prime Minister Carney answered directly and without much hesitation. Here's the core of what he said, rephrased in clear terms. He acknowledged that Canada's relationship with the United States is far more complex, deep, and wide-ranging than the one with China. No one disputes that. The two countries share geography, history, integrated economies, defense ties, intelligence cooperation, cultural links, and much more. However, when it comes to how things have actually played out in recent months, specifically with China, Carney described the interactions as more predictable. He pointed to a pattern of candid, consistent, and frank dialogue, starting from his initial phone call with Premier Li Qiang through meetings in New York, the longer session with Xi in Korea, likely referring to a prior multilateral event, and then the full round of talks in Beijing. That steady, open communication, he explained, has produced tangible results, such as the new strategic partnership framework, tariff reductions, e.g. on canola and electric vehicles, energy cooperation commitments, and other progress in areas where the two sides can work together despite clear differences in political systems. In contrast, the backdrop to his comments was the ongoing uncertainty and volatility in U.S.-Canada relations under the Trump administration at that time. Trump had imposed or threatened broad tariffs on Canadian goods, steel, aluminum, lumber, and more, repeatedly floated ideas about making Canada the 51st state, and created an unpredictable environment for trade and economic planning. So Carney's point wasn't that China is a better partner overall, or that the two countries share the same values. It was a pragmatic observation. In the current moment, dealing with Beijing has felt more stable and outcome-oriented than the recent experience with Washington, where agreements can seem subject to sudden changes or political whims. This remark drew immediate attention because it was unusually candid for a Canadian leader. It reflected a deliberate strategy of diversification, Canada seeking more reliable alternatives amid U.S. trade pressures, while still recognizing the unmatched depth of the U.S. relationship. The full context appeared in major coverage from outlets like the BBC, Reuters, the New York Times, CBC, and others, all reporting from Beijing around January 16 to 17, 2026. In short, the Prime Minister was highlighting practical results from steady engagement with China, while gently underscoring the contrast with the more turbulent recent dynamic with the U.S. It was a calculated, real-world assessment rather than an ideological shift. The statement from Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney that you're asking about came during a high-profile press conference in Beijing on Friday, January 16, 2026, right at the end of his landmark state visit to China. This was the first time a Canadian Prime Minister had traveled to China in 8 years, and the trip produced several concrete announcements, including a preliminary trade deal on tariffs, energy cooperation, and other areas. The question that sparked the headline moment was asked by Martina Stevens-Gridneff, the Canada bureau chief for the New York Times. She put it to Carney directly, paraphrased here for clarity. After your visit, is it fair to say you're concluding that China is now a more predictable and perhaps more reliable partner for Canada than the United States is today? Carney did not dodge it. He answered openly, and his response has been widely quoted and debated ever since. Here's a clear step-by-step breakdown of what he actually said, why he said it, and what it really means in the bigger picture. Carney started by emphasizing that he would speak specifically about Canada's recent engagement with China. He referenced a series of interactions over the past few months. His initial phone call with Premier Li Chang-a meeting in New York, a longer discussion with President Xi Jinping, likely on the sidelines of a regional summit in South Korea in October 2025. And the intensive round of talks during the Beijing visit itself, meetings with Premier Li, Xi, and other senior officials. In all those conversations, he noted that officials spent significant time discussing the guardrails of the relationship, what areas they could cooperate on, where they had clear differences, including in political systems, and how both sides could respect those differences while still moving forward. He described this as candid, consistent, frank dialogue. Steady, open communication without surprises. That kind of reliable back and forth, he said, leads to a more predictable and effective relationship. Then came the key comparison. He immediately acknowledged that Canada's relationship with the United States is much more multifaceted, much deeper, and much broader than the one with China. No one was disputing the enormous importance of the U.S. partnership: shared border, integrated supply chains, defense alliances, intelligence sharing, family ties, cultural links, etc. But yes, when looking strictly at how things have unfolded in recent months with China, he said the relationship is more predictable. And the evidence? Actual results, tangible progress on issues that had been stuck for years. The core idea behind predictable here is reliability in outcomes. In diplomacy and trade, predictability means you know what to expect from the other side. Negotiations move forward steadily without sudden reversals. Agreements reached actually get implemented, or at least advance noticeably. Carney was pointing to the contrast with the United States under President Trump at that exact moment, early 2026. Trump had already imposed or threatened broad tariffs on Canadian exports, steel, aluminum, lumber, autos, and more, up to 35% in some cases. Repeated public suggestions that Canada should become the 51st U.S. state. Ideas about American military or economic control over Canadian resources for national security reasons. An overall pattern of unpredictable, sometimes chaotic trade policy where rules could change abruptly based on tweets, announcements, or political moods. From a Canadian government's perspective, planning long-term investments, supply chains, or trade deals becomes very difficult when your largest partner can shift the ground rules overnight. By contrast, the recent dealings with China, despite all the ideological and systemic differences, had felt steady. Talks produced visible progress, tariff reductions, e.g., China lowering duties on Canadian canola seed from HA 85% to CA 15%, and easing other agricultural barriers, electric vehicle quotas at favorable rates, energy collaboration commitments, and even the promise of visa-free travel for Canadians to China. So Carney's point was pragmatic, not ideological. In the here and now, late 2025 into early 2026, engagement with Beijing had delivered more consistent, outcome-oriented results than the recent experience with Washington. This comment didn't come out of nowhere. It reflected a deliberate Canadian strategy of diversification, reducing over-reliance on the U.S. market after years of escalating friction. Canada had faced retaliatory Chinese tariffs on canola and other goods since 2025, partly linked to earlier tensions. Trump's aggressive tariffs on Canada created economic pain and political cover for seeking alternatives. Beijing, also hit hard by U.S. tariffs, was eager to pull a G7 country and traditional U.S. ally closer. The Beijing visit was the culmination of months of quiet work to reset ties, resulting in a new strategic partnership that Carney described as realistic, respectful, and interest-based. For a Canadian Prime Minister to publicly say, on Chinese soil, after meeting Xi, that dealings with China felt more predictable than with the United States was unusually blunt. It drew immediate headlines worldwide because it highlighted the real impact of Trump's approach on allied relationships. It signaled Canada actively pivoting toward China for trade stability. It underscored a shift in global dynamics. Even close U.S. allies were seeking alternatives amid American unpredictability. Trump himself responded casually at the White House, saying something like, "That's okay, that's what he should be doing," regarding the trade deal, downplaying it. But the comment stuck because it captured a moment when traditional alliances felt strained and countries like Canada were openly recalibrating. In summary, Carney wasn't declaring China a better partner overall. He was making a narrow, evidence-based observation about recent months, steady progress versus volatility, and using it to justify Canada's push for more diversified, reliable trade relationships in a turbulent world. It was diplomatic realism, not a full realignment.